December 7th, 1941, evening in Tokyo. In a blacked-out monitoring room, a naval intelligence officer sits with headphones pressed to his ears, pencil ready above a blank pad. Outside, the Empire is already calling Pearl Harbor a triumph. Inside this room, the work is quieter. He is not listening for ships, he is listening for panic. Across the Pacific, American frequencies should be dissolving into confusion. Interrupted programs, frantic voices, a nation arguing with itself. That is the sound the plan requires. Fear, division, a public ready to calculate the cost of a Pacific war and look for a way out. Instead, through the static, the first clear signal is almost ordinary. A football broadcast, a calm bulletin. Then the game continues. No collapse, no hysteria, only procedure. Battleships are burning in Hawaii. Japanese officers are celebrating a morning that looks complete. But the one result bombs cannot measure is already crossing the ocean in plain language. American will. Recruiting stations are filling before some offices have even opened. Civil defense instructions are delivered without hysteria. And within hours, Franklin Roosevelt will go on the air and turn the attack Japan hoped would fracture the United States into the one thing Tokyo can least afford. A reason for Americans to fight together. The Japanese Navy has won the morning. American radio is already hinting at what the victory might cost, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto has more reason than most Japanese commanders to understand why. Yamamoto has spent years warning that a war with the United States could become a race Japan cannot win. He has studied in America, served in Washington, traveled through the country. He has seen the scale behind the storefronts, oil fields, rail lines, factories, machine tools, assembly lines. He knows that the United States is not dangerous because it is always ready for war. It is dangerous because, once fully mobilized, it can build one. That is why Pearl Harbor has never been only about destroying battleships. The deeper objective is psychological. Hit hard enough, fast enough, and perhaps the United States will decide a Pacific war is too expensive. Japan can seize a defensive perimeter across Asia and the Pacific, strengthen it, and force Washington to negotiate from a position of exhaustion. That logic depends on one assumption. America has to react to Pearl Harbor with fear, division, or hesitation. Inside Nagato's operations room, the distance between Japan and Hawaii can be reduced to clocks, charts, and incoming signals. One clock shows Tokyo time, another shows Hawaii. Between those two times sits the entire gamble. Tactical reports can tell Yamamoto whether torpedoes have struck. They can tell him which battleships are burning, but they cannot tell him what 130 million Americans are deciding in kitchens, train stations, factories, churches, and living rooms. For that, Japan needs voices. And those voices matter because Yamamoto's own career has made him skeptical of the stereotype behind the plan. He knows Americans can argue loudly before a war and still mobilize violently once one begins. So while younger officers see Pearl Harbor as proof, the radio offers the first real test of whether the victory has achieved the only result that can make a short Japanese war possible. Across Tokyo, monitoring desks search American frequencies. News agencies listen. Government offices listen. The Navy listens. For years, Japanese analysts have heard isolationist speeches from the United States. Politicians warning against foreign wars. Americans arguing over aid to Britain. A country deeply reluctant to send its sons overseas. Those broadcasts helped create a picture of America as rich and powerful, but politically unwilling to endure a long war. Now the experiment is live. Pearl Harbor has delivered the shock. The radios will reveal whether that shock has broken the target. The bombs have answered what America can lose. The radios are answering the question Japan actually needs. What will America do next? And the first answer does not come from the White House. It comes through ordinary American broadcasting. At the Polo Grounds in New York, a football game is underway when news of the attack interrupts the program. The bulletin is brief. Japanese aircraft have attacked Pearl Harbor. Then the broadcast continues. Across other networks, reports come rapidly, but the tone is controlled. Details are incomplete. Rumors are marked as rumors. Listeners are told to stay tuned. On the West Coast, stations carry blackout orders and civil defense instructions. Report to your assigned post. Reduce lights. Await further information. Japan is listening for panic. Instead, it hears procedure. There is fear in America. There is confusion, but there is no national collapse. That difference matters because Japanese naval doctrine is built around visible destruction. Count ships sunk. Count aircraft destroyed. Count runways cratered. By those measurements, Pearl Harbor looks extraordinary. But the strategy requires another measurement. Does the attack make Americans want less war? Within hours, the answer is beginning to look uncomfortable. Reports appear of men gathering outside recruiting offices. At some locations, lines form before the doors open. Young men try to enlist. Others who have shown little interest in the conflict suddenly want uniforms. The attack is not pushing war farther away from ordinary Americans. It has brought the war directly into their homes. And then, American radio begins repeating a phrase Japan has never wanted attached to Pearl Harbor. Sneak attack. That phrase is about to become almost as damaging as anything that happened in Hawaii. Japan has intended to break off negotiations before the attack became known. But the final diplomatic message in Washington is delayed. By the time it reaches the American government, Pearl Harbor is already under attack. That timing failure changes the emotional meaning of the morning. Instead of hearing that war has begun, Americans hear that they were attacked while talks were still underway. Radio turns that failure into a national story. Treachery. Deception. A surprise blow delivered before diplomacy has formally ended. For a strategy built around eventually negotiating with Washington, that is a disaster. Because negotiations require an enemy willing to separate battlefield loss from moral outrage. Pearl Harbor fuses them together. And the most important broadcast has not even happened yet. On December 8th, Japanese monitors wait for Franklin Roosevelt to address Congress. This is the moment that matters more than any casualty estimate from Hawaii. If Tokyo's theory is right, the president should face a divided legislature and a frightened public. His words might reveal caution, perhaps an opening for negotiation, perhaps a warning that America cannot fight everywhere. Instead, Roosevelt begins with a phrase that will define Pearl Harbor permanently, a date which will live in infamy. That sentence changes the category of the event. Pearl Harbor is no longer simply a military defeat. It is a grievance. Roosevelt lists Japanese attacks across the Pacific and Asia, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya. The point is not only that America has been attacked, the attacks are part of something larger. Then comes the answer Japanese listeners need most. Roosevelt promises that the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Absolute. Not negotiation. Not a limited settlement. Not a calculation over whether distant islands are worth the cost. Victory. And behind Roosevelt's voice comes another sound. Congress cheering. That may be even more alarming than the speech. Japanese analysts have spent years watching American political divisions. Now senators and representatives who have argued bitterly over foreign policy are standing together. The Senate approves war without a dissenting vote. The House follows with only one vote against. 1. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist. Japan has counted on political friction. Pearl Harbor almost erases it overnight. Even prominent isolationists change course. Charles Lindbergh has been one of the most famous voices opposing American involvement. But once war has come, he says the country has to fight. The America First Committee soon dissolves and urges supporters to support the war effort. The monitors are recording something Tokyo's victory broadcasts cannot absorb. The movement Tokyo hoped might restrain Washington has not become Japan's negotiating partner. It disappears. And here the story becomes much more revealing, because Japan is now listening to two completely different wars. On domestic radio, the empire hears triumph. Pearl Harbor, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines. Japanese newspapers print victories. Crowds celebrate. Military leaders point to the map and say the plan is working. But the monitoring rooms are hearing something else. Recruiting, mobilization, production, shipbuilding, war bonds, congressional unity. One war looks brilliant, the other looks dangerous. The contrast inside Japan is almost surreal. Radio Tokyo carries martial music and victory announcements. Newspapers describe an enemy fleet devastated in Hawaii. To the public, the opening days sound like confirmation that the empire has seized the initiative everywhere at once. But foreign broadcast monitors are collecting material that does not fit the celebration. The same country supposedly stunned into submission is debating how many factories to convert, how many ships to launch, how many men to train, and how quickly to do it. The transcripts do not look dramatic beside photographs of burning battleships. That is exactly the problem. They look like paperwork. And paperwork is easy to ignore when the map is covered in victories. For months, Japan keeps winning. Hong Kong falls, British warships go down off Malaya. Singapore surrenders. The Dutch East Indies are taken. The Philippines are collapsing. Each new victory seems to prove Pearl Harbor has worked. But American radio gradually changes vocabulary. The emergency bulletins give way to something else. Numbers. In the same week, Japanese newspapers still print maps of conquest. A monitor's transcript fills with a different kind of inventory. Not islands taken, not ships claimed. Factory targets, training quotas, shipway schedules. The drama is not in the adjectives, it is in the scale, and in the calm with which Americans discuss it. Yamamoto does not need the poetry. He has walked the country those numbers come from. In January 1942, Roosevelt publicly demands production on a scale that sounds almost unreal. 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, millions of tons of shipping. Japanese monitors can write the numbers down. Yamamoto has a better reason to fear them. He has seen where those numbers can come from, and Pearl Harbor has left America with tools to use them. The battleships have taken terrible damage, but the American aircraft carriers are not in harbor that morning. Enterprise is at sea. Lexington is away. Saratoga is on the west coast. The ships that will become decisive weapons in the Pacific survive. So do Pearl Harbor's fuel storage and repair facilities. The attack smashes ships without permanently destroying the base that can help restore them. Salvage crews go to work. Damaged vessels are raised, repaired, rebuilt. The harbor Japan wanted to make unusable remains an operating base. By April, the map still favors Japan. The radio no longer does. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the listening war stops being one-directional. April 18, 1942. Air raid sirens sound over Tokyo. American B-25 bombers appear over Japan. The Doolittle raid causes limited physical damage. Psychologically, it is enormous. Japanese broadcasts have presented the homeland as secure. Now residents can look up and see American bombers crossing the capital in daylight. And those aircraft have come from the one part of the US fleet Pearl Harbor failed to destroy. Carriers. The raid helps push Japanese leaders toward the decisive battle Yamamoto wants. If the American carriers can be lured out and destroyed, perhaps the strategic clock can still be stopped. The target becomes a tiny coral atoll, Midway. And here, the radio story reverses completely. Before Pearl Harbor, Japan listened to American communications and tried to read American will. Before Midway, America is listening to Japan. American codebreakers reconstruct enough Japanese communications to identify the coming operation. The US carriers position northeast of Midway before Japan's strike force arrives. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers find the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, then Hiryu. 4 carriers lost. Many veteran airmen lost with them. The force that attacked Pearl Harbor is broken 6 months later. Yamamoto's warning about time has become brutally literal. Japan expected to run wild for months, and it did. But while the map showed Japanese expansion, the radios had been describing the larger transformation from the beginning. The United States is not retreating into negotiation. It is converting outrage into manpower, industry, ships, aircraft, and political unity. That does not mean every American remains calm. There is fear, confusion, prejudice, failure. But the strategic fact Tokyo needed is much simpler. Pearl Harbor did not reduce America's willingness to fight. It multiplied it. That is why the quietest part of December 7th may have been the most important. Not the explosions, not the victory messages, the listening rooms, headphones pressed tight, pencils moving across paper, American voices crossing the Pacific through static, a football game interrupted, a calm announcer, recruiting lines, the word infamy, Congress roaring, one dissenting vote. The evidence was arriving almost immediately. Japan attacked the Pacific Fleet, hoping the shock would create a political opening. Instead, the attack closed it. Over the next 4 years, Japan will lose the carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor, the perimeter built in 1942, much of its merchant shipping, much of its air power, and eventually the ability to defend the home islands from sustained bombing. Yamamoto will not live to see the end. In 1943, American forces use intercepted Japanese communications to locate his inspection flight and shoot his aircraft down over Bougainville. The man who understood American industrial power better than most Japanese commanders becomes another casualty of an intelligence war fought through the airwaves. By 1945, the irony is complete. The war that began with Japan monitoring American radio ends with millions of Japanese civilians gathered around radios of their own. On August 15, they hear Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice announce acceptance of the Allied terms. The medium that offered Japan an early warning about American resolve now delivers the final acknowledgement that the warning had been correct. Japan's opening gamble assumed shock would create bargaining room. Instead, the first day created a political memory Americans would carry through Midway, Guadalcanal, the submarine campaign, the island offensives, the bombing of Japan, and finally surrender. 4 years earlier, Tokyo listened for panic and heard organization. It listened for division and heard unity. It listened for hesitation and heard absolute victory. The warning was not hidden, it was transmitted openly. The real mistake was believing that sinking ships and breaking a nation's will were the same thing. Pearl Harbor proved Japan could accomplish the first. American radio began proving almost immediately that it had failed at the second. The explosions at Pearl Harbor told Japan how much damage it had done. The voices coming through the radio told Japan something far more important: what America was going to do about it. And once that became clear, the most dangerous sound Japan heard after Pearl Harbor was not anger. It was a country getting organized.